Hello, I'm Peter Kenny. My background is in financial services, at least for the purposes of this discussion, in risk compliance and a bit of governance here and there. And today I'm going to talk to Mark about leveraging overseas regulators' content.
Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and as you just heard today, I get to spend some more time with Peter Kenny. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Mark.
Peter and I worked together many years ago at AMP, as it was then, and stayed in touch over the years, worked together recently in the Financial Services Council on a number of projects. So we still work together work in the same industry in different companies. And Peter is someone who I've always admired as having this really strong ability to get to the nugget of what really needs to be seen in particular issues. And so I really appreciate having time with you. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Mark.
Today, as you said, we're going to be talking about leveraging foreign guidance in regulation. New Zealand's regulation tends to be very principles based, and so you end up in many industries, and particularly in financial services where we work, with broad ideas about what you need to do, but nothing really specific. Nobody's saying this is how you have to do it. And overseas regulators can be far more prescriptive. So we want to talk a little bit about how well that can be used. My first question for you then is, let's look at Australia, because we know that Australia has very dictatorial approach to their regulation. If we look at ASIC and APRA and the financial services, for example, can New Zealand entities benefit from Australia's prescriptive regulations?
In a word, yes. So, look, one of your challenges, and look, to start out, we've got quite similar products in some instances, and services. And, we do have a lot of commonality between Australia and New Zealand. I mean, let's face it, in terms of, it's not exactly a foreign place to go when you visit and vice versa, right? So the benefit that you get from the foreign jurisdiction, in this case Australia, is that prescription, when you're lacking it, you can use it to your advantage, right? So a principle-based regime is great, but quite often you're sitting there wondering, well, how do I actually go and apply this? Or, what type of rules can I actually go and apply into my business that actually might make sense for me? And that's where you can actually win the Bledisloe Cup by having your cake and eating the Australian piece of the cake too.
Right, yes, and by which you're suggesting that principles-based regulation is very flexible, so you have the ability to run the business the way you want it to run, and no one's telling you have to do it this way. But the Australian regulations and guidance on those regulations can give you some very firm direction in a way that you can meet those principles-based regulations.
Well, I guess the key point is don't be allergic to the fact that it's actually got an Australian badge on the front of it. You're not required to use it. Well, some of you may be, because you might be in entities that are trans-Tasman, and there can be tentacles between the two. But if you're not, then don't ignore it, because if you're sitting there trying to struggle, say you're in a risk area or a governance area, and you're saying, don't really know what I'm going to put in for something, reporting to the board on particular matters, you might find it sitting inside. I can tell you will find it sitting inside, say some of the APRA standards and guidance,
right.
Particularly standards, where they'll say, these particular things absolutely need to be reported. You might go, oh, actually, that's actually saved me a bunch of effort, actually thinking about what I would actually put in there. But the good news is that, say you find a particular area where there's 10 things, you don't have to take all 10. You might say, hey, I only like 6 of these, and I only take 6, and that's fine, because you're not forced to.
Yes, right. You've alluded to there the fact that many large New Zealand companies are Australian owned, and those Australian parents are required to follow those rules. In your experience, what sorts of responses do you have from Australian parents trying to encourage New Zealanders to follow New Zealand regulation? Do they say, "Hi, look, just make it consistent and do the same as we do, and we'll be fine," or actually take the benefits of your non-prescriptive regulation and just use the good stuff?
Well, and sometimes you do get the kind of obnoxious thing, which is, we have to follow our standards and you have to follow yours and ours, which is one that, sort of rankles at times.
Yeah.
In fact, more than at times, it just rankles full stop. Look, there's multitudes of answers to that question, I guess, is the thing.
It depends on each individual company, right?
And it can depend on the particular scenario. So, we'll pick one which, causes, some interesting debates and discussions, which is, AML, CFT. There's enough differences between that regime in Australia and the regime here, and, different types of regulators. They've got one Austrac, we've got three supervisors. The setup is very different. They'll have, we have a risk assessment and a program. You have to show a very clear connection between your program to what's actually been in the risk assessment. So it's a kind of different fundamental setup, even though they've got some similar, things required, which is just standard AML, CFT things everywhere, right? There's going to be some CDD or KYC, depending on your flavour of what you want to call it, and all those sorts of things with some differences.
Yes, and that's a really good example, because in Australia, Austrac is a centralised reporting entity, right? Whereas here in New Zealand, each entity is kind of responsible for their own identification through customer due diligence, politically exposed persons. Everyone has their own way of identifying them, right? Rather than saying, "Oh, look, they're on a centralised database." Pretty costly approach. Now, you've alluded to some of these already, but there may be others. What benefits are there for New Zealand entities, boards and risk teams and so forth of looking to, let's say, Australian guidance and regulation?
Yeah, so, I can give you one specific example, right? So say you were challenged with, we want to have some clear things that we are absolutely going to report to our board. Now, if you go and look at some of the New Zealand-based guidance around that, you might not actually get a lot. In fact, you probably won't get much. Whereas if you pick that up and have a look and you say, okay, well, why don't we just go and see what the Australians will be required to do in our industry, right? So if you jumped in there and had a look at, say, the insurers space in Australia, you'll find across all of those CPSs, that's the common prudential standards, you'll find masses of things in there that are actually required to be reported. So again, you can say, well, okay, I've got my nice principles-based thing here, but actually, if I'm going to write something that's actually going to be a bit more hard-coded for us, because actually we want to put that into our, say, risk management program, for example, then you've got the ability to actually just go and say, okay, what type of things would we actually put in there? And they're probably things, when you look at them, are quite common sense. So, you can save yourself a little bit of time and energy. What you might want to do, and it's not the topic for today though, is you might want to get your AI out there and say, can you go and trawl those and tell me what the reporting requirements are, right?
That's true,
That might be a bit quicker. I might try that when I go home.
Particularly if you then start looking outside as well, if you start looking at other countries like the United Kingdom and Canada and maybe the European Union and take all of their regulations and pop them into your and say, pull out the best for me. Tell me what's there.
Well, look, it's probably a natural place for us to go with this conversation. What can you use for some of those overseas jurisdictions as well? The really obvious one, since we're on the AO topic at the moment, would be EU is light years ahead of everyone else at the moment in terms of what they're doing with the AO regulation. Interesting, if you look at where we're at, we've got absolutely nothing, no real sign of anything happening. And it'll be interesting to see what Judith Collins comes out in that space, because she's got quite a few portfolios in her space that actually overlap in there.
That will be an interesting area to follow over the next few years, and certainly the image generators and requirements to identify that it's a fake image and those sorts of things that are coming through the UK through the European Union. It'll be very. Hopefully, we'll catch up sooner rather than later before all the harm happens.
Might be all over before we get there.
Yeah, maybe. Just coming back to the Australian regulation and our example of in financial services that we can then broaden outside of financial services. How can a New Zealand entity go about finding Australian regulation and, very importantly, understanding it?
Finding it. Okay, so websites is the really obvious one, although it can be a little bit tricky finding what you're looking for in there. But the APRA stuff you can tend to find reasonably easily if you go down a few layers. So say you're interested in superannuation, you'll be able to find all of the prudential standards regarding superannuation and then the guidance to the CPGs and the CPSs and the CPGs. And in the ASIC space, that's reasonably straightforward finding it as well. You know, you've got the regulatory guides and those sorts of things. So yeah, look, I mean, it's not usually too hard. In terms of understanding it, depends what your, I will call it, use cases. So, you know, you're not going in there in all likelihood, well, I'll take the non-lawyer perspective, right? If you're going in there to fully understand it as a lawyer, you're asking the wrong person because I'm not one. If you're going in there to try and pick the eyes out of it to find some nuggets, gold nuggets in Australia, it's quite appropriate, then, you know, then it's just common sense, I think. You know, what am I looking for? Some searches across it. Does it look like it's covering the type of area that I'm actually looking at? Yeah, I mean, it's just, I'd just call it be pragmatic.
So having some expertise in the realm,
so
sure, that you're then able to dig in, find out how the regulator are, as if you don't already know. So if you go into a jurisdiction that you haven't been to before, identifying who the regulator is, finding the material, as you say, by following your nose to a large extent, and then I guess ideally critically reading it, and you know, reading it with an educated eye to say this makes sense to me, and this doesn't fit for our regulatory environment in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we'll take an example, right? So, say you're in this insurance space again. You know, here we've got the in the Reserve Bank space for insurers, you've got, you know, the governance guidance. Yeah.
Yes.
There was obviously the FMA and the RBNZ's last year governance thematic.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
But, you know, if you wanted some further reading and, you know, that was what you were being asked to go and look at and think about it a bit further and say, you know, is there any other best practice out there, then obviously go and have a look and see what's in the governance space inside, say, the APRA guidelines or standards.
Yeah, and I guess going out further abroad, you know, Australia is the obvious place to go over the ditch, and as we've discussed, New Zealand's regulation tends to be very principles-based. They tend to be a lot more defined in Australian regulation. It's very easy then to stretch out to the United Kingdom, to stretch out to Canada, being Commonwealth entities. Europe is you know, big and also a very influential regulatory.
Well, I mean, there's another example I just thought of then, was that, you know, sometimes they can be a good portent of things to come as well. So, you know, we'll take, you know, the payment insurance in the UK, you know, which sparked, you know, enormous furore.
That's right.
And then, you know, realistically though, it was the, you know, lead into conduct and culture that, you know, occurred then, you know, 5 to 7 years later here, and then, you know, starting with the FMA's conduct guide, and then of course the infamous Australian Royal Commission and the fallout, and then the life insurers and banks reviews by FMA and RBNZ. So, you know, sometimes when you're looking at what those developments are in those foreign jurisdictions and what they're developing in terms of their regulatory rules, you know, that can be helpful for giving you a bit of a view as to what might be coming down the pipe.
Right, a really good insight for what can be happening. Are there any, in your experiences, particularly useful foreign sources for regulation or guidance?
I've probably mentioned most of those already, but you know, I think Australia's probably our key one. When you're going a little bit further afield, yeah, look, I mean, maybe not so much. I mean, it's probably best to stick to Australia for the most part. I mean, maybe some of the UK material. I mean, if there's nothing else in terms of, you know, between the jurisdictions, then yeah, probably further afield. I think the good example there was, you know, say the AI developments at the moment. And look, I mean, others should be probably doing it to us in reverse, right? Because you know, climate reporting here is a good lead for, you know, many overseas, because, you know, Australia's now going down that path. So, you know, they should be having a look at what's happening or what actually happened in terms of what we rolled out.
So I would say then, broadening the conversation beyond our experience in financial services, in every industry there would be countries that you would follow because they tend to lead in many ways in your industry. It's likely to have significant overlap with Commonwealth because that's our history. But there may be certain industries where it might be places in Asia or things that lead the way in these things, or it might be Europe, or it might be the US in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's more of a open mind thing on that, and, you know, if you're not doing it because you're looking for the rules to something, but you're looking for, you know, help, then, you know, it's whatever actually works for you, I think.
Are there any non-government sources that you would suggest, or would you recommend non-government sources? And let me elaborate a little bit. Regulators and what we've been talking about so far are quite often in this country, if you want to understand regulation, you might get a good steer from the Financial Services Council or from one of the law firms.
Well, look, we'll go back to, we'll just use the AML, which I think we touched on before, didn't we? So, you know, there's a lot of FATF material, for example, you know, Financial Action Task Force. There's a lot of material there that's absolutely great when you actually go and dive in there if you're an AML compliance officer, for example. Yeah, made some, you know, excellent use of some of that material for doing the submission on the AML CFT Act, for example.
Yes.
So, yeah, the other organisations and just actually some of the compliance entities as well. Yeah, so, you know, if you're looking at Australia, you've got the Australia Compliance Institute. I can't remember the UK one, but I've had a look at a little bit of their material before. Yeah,
and like anything when you're Googling, right, it's about trying to understand who you've got this from. So do a little bit of background check to make sure it's a reputable source.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
But you know, in the insurance world, you've got IOSCO as another example.
Yeah, there's lots of others that that we could have called out. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So so a bit of a summary then, very useful because New Zealand's regulation tends to be very principles based. So you end up with a lot of flexibility for how you meet regulations, but you've still got to try and meet them. And when you're looking for, well, how exactly am I going to meet these, quite often foreign regulation can be a good source, particularly in a country that is much more prescriptive in its approach. And while you wouldn't want to pick it up and drop it because it'll have its own local context, you'll be able to read through with your critical and educated eye to find out what's relevant and pull it out and potentially use what works.
Save yourself a lot of time and energy, yes, and make use of what's there. If it's been done before, don't reinvent it.
Absolutely. And your sources, you've got your regulatory bodies, your industry groups in those various countries, and potentially your law firms and compliance companies and industry groups as well. But when you're doing your research, just make sure you're identifying, well, again, it's just thinking critically, right? You might even get some nuggets of information from a less reputable source, but if, the higher reputable sources can be...
As long as you, apply your critical eye to it, and if it still makes sense, then, if it sparks some insight, then well and good.
Absolutely. Okay, well, a bit of a change topic for the final question for you. What advice would you give to a new director?
Okay, well, I'm going to partly leverage an answer that actually was reasonably recent. One is read, but a little bit more than that, actually make use of Institute of Directors material, and in particular, I did it a long time ago now, I think it was 2010, go on the company's directors course. Because is that a plug? I don't know. No, but I mean it was really valuable, particularly when you hadn't actually been inside the governance space for a long time. And looking back on that, there was actually really good content, good people, great presenters. So I would say do that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. On that point, one of the things I recall, one of the duties of a director is the standard care, diligence and skill, right? And I do a lot of work with financial advisors where they've got a care diligence and skill requirement, as you know.
And
the I code. Say to them, many of them are directors of financial advice providers, got their own businesses and so forth. I say, well, that care diligence and skill relates to you being a financial advisor. You also have this requirement of having care diligence and skill to be a director of your company. And training like the Institute of Directors, the Chartered Governance Institute of New Zealand, those sorts of bodies have some really great material. So great advice. Cool. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much for your time. Great to chat again.
Okay.
See you next episode. Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.